Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for joining me for the 11th episode in the Conversation with Alan series tonight. I'm Alan Locher. I created Conversations with Alan to have open and honest discussions about the rise of hate and the rise of anti-Semitism, with high hopes that it leads to conversations that make us all think about our own place in history and what we can do together to change our country's course. My guest tonight is Dr. Dan French, an author, educator, and a doctor of rhetoric. As we approach tomorrow's anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, Dan and I will look back on how rhetoric has played a very important and dangerous part in that event and so many other historical events. Dr. French earned his PhD in rhetoric from the University of South Florida. He recently released a new book, The 21 Coliseums of Persuasion, Winning Every Battle by Knowing Every Theory. In addition to the book, he created Rhetoric Warriors to help people who are struggling with the volatile politics that split families, destroy relationships, and threaten the foundation of American democracy. He believes great persuasion changes everything. I am really so happy to have Dr. French here tonight to discuss the power of rhetoric at a time where we're seeing it used to spread lies, misinformation, and cause harm. Please welcome to the Locher Room, Dr. Dan French.
Hey, Alan.
Hey, Dan. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm at the beach with all sorts of crazy light going on. So
I wish I was at the beach. It's cold here in New Jersey. Thank you really so much for being here. You know, it's there's so much to understand about the power of rhetoric, you know, and how it plays out in our world. I mean, we hear it every day. It's playing out in our politics. It's playing out in regards to the COVID vaccine. To you and your definition, how would you describe the meaning of rhetoric?
Yeah, I think rhetoric gets misunderstood a lot because it hasn't been taught specifically as rhetoric for a long time. So when people hear the word rhetoric, they often think of just the kind of hollow talk, the sort of fake talk where it's just rhetoric. That there's no foundation to what is behind the words. And you hear it a lot in politics that, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric going on. Don't believe it because, you know, rhetoric is just there as fiction. That's kind of a misunderstanding of rhetoric. Rhetoric is better understood as it's all intentional message building. So if you are intentionally working on your messages before you send them out in order to increase their likelihood of success, then you're being rhetorical. And that can be done in positive ways, like just making them really clear. Like if you write something over and over again to make sure that it's very concise and clear, you're being rhetorical because you're adapting that message to make it better. Or if you're using unethical techniques where, you know, you are creating falsehoods, you're using deception, you're using fear tactics, all this, that's also rhetoric, but it's just the dark arts of rhetoric versus kind of the white arts of rhetoric.
And where did your interest in rhetoric start?
I've always been fascinated by language. Like I was just as a kid, I would just read and every time I'd run into a word, I would explore that word. I've always loved poetry, jokes. I'm a comedy writer. So anything that has to do with the sort of the, you know, wrangling of language interests me. And the interesting about rhetoric is that it has very specific applications in the world. It's a pragmatic art. So if you're learning rhetoric, it's because you're trying to get something done. So like your thing about, you know, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, that's something you want to fight in the world. Mm-hmm. And so rhetoric has this huge set of theory and tactics and knowledge because it's been studied for 2,500 years. And you could go, okay, I'm going to go, you know, sort of harvest some of that and bring it over because I want to get something done. And I think that's why I was really attracted to rhetoric, is because it's a doer's art. It actually has things in the world that get done.
Was there, you know, to go back, did you go back to school? Because you did, right? To go back to school to become a doctor of rhetoric. Was there some moment, you know, in something happening in the world that made you choose at that point to take that on?
Not really. I just have an obsession with learning. So I was an undergraduate English / journalism double major. And so again, writer, you know, working with words, but I didn't like any of the jobs. I hated journalism. I feel sorry for journalists because they're so restricted in what they can say. Like, it's such a constricted form of writing. Instead of being able to say, oh, this guy's lying, they have to go through this sort of arcane, roundabout way of saying it. And I just didn't like it. I don't like that kind of restricted writing. Then I went to grad school because I didn't have a job. So I'm like, well, I guess I'll go to grad school. And I jumped over to speech communication, which also you can get a rhetoric degree in English departments, so written rhetoric, or in speech departments, it's more about verbal and, electronic and digital and things like that. They both study the same things, but just in kind of a different tradition. And so I really enjoyed it. And I started teaching as an undergrad, as a master's student. And I taught for 3 years at the University of Louisville, and then liked it enough to go back and get a PhD.
Wow.
But I didn't have anything particular I was trying to do in the world. But I'll tell you a story about a guy that does, which is a great story. He's a super rhetorician named Jim Mackin, who died a few years back. And he was in grad school at UT Austin the same time I was getting my master's degree there. Super smart guy. Taught himself ancient Greek because he wanted to read all the Greeks in their original language because he didn't, trust the interpretations, the translations.
Wow.
And great guy, just a really great Greek scholar. But he had been a fighter pilot in Vietnam and flew missions dropping napalm, bombing villages, all of it. And I remember him telling me the first day that I met him that was why he came back to get a PhD in rhetoric. Because he's like, there's got to be a better way. And I feel like I've got to make up for what I can't let this happen again if I can do anything about it. So you do get people that are that very precisely focused on why it can be useful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. What does it take for someone to become a rhetorician?
There's a lot of different types of rhetoricians. Rhetoric, again, covers the whole scope of human talk, really. Like, you can study how people do persuasion/rhetoric in relationships. You can study all the way up to the biggest politics, to war rhetoric and presidential rhetoric. And so, it's one of those things that's got a lot of scope to it and lets you sort of find what you're interested in. So you can kind of look around and adapt it kind of to what you want to do with it. Like, I studied entertainment a lot of my career because I was really fascinated with how entertainment forms take over cultures and become, some of the primary messaging structures. And I think when you look at politics right now, what happened on a mega level is politics merged with entertainment. Like, entertainment became so strong. Trump is essentially a reality show actor acting like a politician.
Right.
He's doing all the things that you learn in reality show, which is constantly cause problems, constantly draw all the attention to yourself. It's just basic entertainment principles. And just know that other politicians are doing it, not as well, at least.
I mean, basically, everybody in reality is looking for the ratings, looking to
just eyeballs. Yeah.
Eyeballs, right. Grab the largest audience. For me, when I saw the events unfold in Charlottesville, Virginia, and heard people chanting, "Jews will not replace us," this is, I wanted to use my voice where my parents no longer could, to speak up about the rise of anti-Semitism. And at the time of Charlottesville, I didn't have this show. How can I and others help people understand the power rhetoric plays on events like that?
Well, think of rhetoric as a storm. Sometimes this is one of my favorite descriptions of what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is a symbol storm. So what you find is that it all groups around a certain thing, and like Jewish. Okay, so the Jewish tradition has all these symbols, all this huge set of storm symbols that you learn about the Jewish culture. Or when you're raised Jewish, you learn, like, Hanukkah and all the different things that are specific to that culture. Mm-hmm. So there's literally a Jewish symbol storm in the world. And when you start doing things like trying to work against anti-Semitism, a lot of times the first thing you have to do is get people to be who aren't living in that storm, who didn't grow up in it, maybe who aren't in New York and haven't been around a lot of Jewish, communities. Mm-hmm. I've lived in LA, so I've been around a lot of, Jewish people in the industry, and even in grad school, the intellectual tradition has tons of Jewish scholars, and so I've had a lot of experience with it. But I grew up in Kentucky. Before that moment, I knew nothing other than what I'd seen in the media, basically about Jewish community and Jewish culture. So part of it is doing that basic thing of teaching people your storm, and until you can do that, it's hard to do the more advanced stuff like, hey, there's negative parts, other storms are coming in and doing damage to us. And that's essentially the Germans took the Jewish community, the Jewish culture, and turned it from a normal culture into an evil entity. And that's one of the things rhetoric can do. It's called praise and blame, epidictic rhetoric, where you make it either light or dark. You praise it or you blame it. And it's a very primary strategy in rhetoric. And the Germans used it against the Jews.
In a very large way.
Yeah. And but you see it now, the conservatives are using it. You can take the word liberal and put in the word Jew and get basically German rhetoric. Like they've just used the word liberal as their hate term. And it's vehement and it's ugly and it's deceptive, but it's basic rhetoric. It's basic blame rhetoric.
Well, tomorrow being the 1-year anniversary since the riot, the Capitol insurrection, in your perspective, how did rhetoric play a part in getting, that tragic event to take place?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. We haven't had those kind of public attacks on the government en masse like that for a while. We had a lot of small ones, like back in the 70s, a lot of terrorism and things like that, sort of small attacks where one person, like Timothy McVeigh blows up, something. And we've had a lot of that. But this big, herd of people showing up, at a major American symbol location and, going like that, we haven't had that for a while. Even back, remember, like during the Democratic National Convention, and it was the hippies doing that. It was the left side doing that, but we haven't had the right do that before. I don't think. I'm trying to think of the last time maybe that happened. So it was an unusual event, but all the processes are the same. You basically say there's some kind of evil going on. It has to be stopped. You're the ones that can stop it. So come on.
Well, and that really started with the lie about the election.
Yeah, it started way before that. Like if you look at Trump again as an inciter in chief, like he just constantly tells people to be more and more upset than they are. I mean, from his day one during, his inauguration, when he's like, they're lying about how many people showed up. It's just constant. There's probably in the 4 years and the 5 years he was running, including the running year, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of things that he pushed people to get upset about. This was just the most recent one.
Yeah, I mean, we have never had somebody in the White House who incited violence the way this president has, or if we did, it's very long time ago, not in our lifetime.
Kind of not true. I'll tell you why. Like,
okay. No, please.
Like presidents and politicians always incite violence. That's one of the ways they control. That's one of the ways they gain power and status, is that I've got the power to protect you. And so like the first thing that George Bush did when we got attacked on 9/11, standing on top of the rubble with, the bullhorn, was, we will get revenge. Well, that's, go attack people. It seems like it's more justified than this situation, but then now we look back and like, well, when he said go attack people, it turns out like he meant Iraq and Afghanistan and, all these places. And you're like, hey, we said go get the guy who did this, but they just expanded it to, I'm going to attack all these people, and we didn't really see that at the time. So Trump, the weird thing about Trump and the weird thing about this whole movement is it's the first time I've seen, again, in recent history, that they've turned Americans against Americans. You know,
Yeah.
usually it's a foreign enemy. Like even Jewish people, the Jewish community within the German culture was a tiny subculture in Germany. You know, and it wasn't a traditional German culture. It came later. You know, it immigrated, and it's easier to turn people against sort of the minorities and the strange entities. So, but presidents and people in power always encourage violence. It's just righteous violence versus non-righteous violence.
Gotcha. You know, going back to, you know, my parents and them being Holocaust survivors, can you talk a little and help me understand how Hitler used rhetoric and mass media propaganda to advance his cause?
Yeah, Hitler, everybody looks at him like he's some type of super persuader, but realistically, he was just the first person, and it wasn't him, it was his whole movement that merged technology and media with this old hate rhetoric. Like the hate rhetoric for immigrants and encroaching people and new arrivals and all that stuff is constant throughout cultures. Cultures don't blend well at first. You know, you figure out how you want to live in this culture, and then people start arriving who are different gods, different, you know, habits, different, and you're like, I don't like a lot of that. And so that encroaching situation, it makes it perfect for that kind of hate rhetoric to grow. But like a lot of people don't know, with the Nazi Party, they gave out transistor radios around the whole country so that they could actually broadcast, just like social media is like a form of social media. They could direct broadcast their propaganda right into people's homes. You know, and this was before TV and all that stuff was available. And the reason that the right has risen again, you know, the hate right, the extreme right, is social media, period. Because it's a distribution platform for an old hate rhetoric. And that hate rhetoric is powerful. But when you match it up with a distribution platform that's unmonitored and ungoverned, you know, there's nobody controlling it, it gets really dangerous really fast.
Which I think is, you know, clearly what led to, you know, the insurrection. I mean,
Trump would have never have been in power if it wasn't for Twitter.
True.
Not even close. I mean, he was a clown. Like when he started running against people, he ran from like 2004 on. He was always trying to get in, and they just wouldn't let him. And then social media popped up, and he'd done, you know, the Apprentice, so people kind of knew him in a broader national scope, and suddenly he was viable. But
I mean, it's an understatement, and it's an understatement what, you know, the Apprentice did for his popularity in that sense.
Yeah, it's hero rhetoric.
Yeah. It's mind-blowing. I mean, to see what transpired. I mean, I know politicians all over the world use rhetoric to divide and drive, you know, people in horrible directions. Is there anything we as a society can do to prevent, you know, something like this from happening again?
Yeah, there's tons of things we can do. That's my whole game, is teaching those things to people. Like, good. Again, rhetoric is dark arts and white arts, and these will never go away. It's just forever, like the dark arts in America were small. You know, the KKK and white supremacist groups and anti-Semitic groups and anti-women groups, all these things have been around America since the beginning. They've just been small. The problem now is that there's a distribution platform and there's money in it. There's power structures that are creating these rhetorics. It's now formalized. It's not some guy in his basement. And so they've sort of amped up the rhetoric machine. So the first thing we can do on the good people's side, the ethical rhetoricians' side, is to look at their machine and start trying to dismantle it. Because they've got a rhetoric machine, and it is charged up and running hard. So one of the things I do is teach people how to do that. Like, how do you dismantle the machinery? Like, if you go after the messaging once it's already created, you're in trouble, because the messaging will not stop. They just keep making it. The better way is to go, a lot of it becomes war rhetoric. Go back in and destroy their factories.
It's interesting because I think back to Charlottesville and being able to see that visually. I know like my parents knew anti-Semitism still existed in our world, but to see it in all its glory right there on the screen,
pretty intense.
Yeah, I mean it really, and I think to my parents, that was 75 years after World War II. If they were alive, what could possibly be going through their head? Like, is this really happening again? And here where they escaped to, moving to the US for a better life, and it's, following them here. But what you say about social media, it's changed the game for the dark arts you describe, being able to create a large, like even down in Charlottesville, I'm sure the group of them came through social media.
Yeah, it's a brand new communication format. It's never existed before on the planet, and it's doing weird things. And so we'll start to get a handle on it. Like even when, Taylor Greene got kicked off Twitter last week, the moment Trump got kicked off Twitter, the world changed.
Completely. I mean, anybody with two eyeballs can see that.
It was like a silence, like suddenly like quiet.
I think everybody's shoulders dropped. We all took a sigh of relief. It really, you're not kidding. And somebody like, Taylor Greene as well. Like I was thrilled to see that. I don't really consider myself very political, but I found it hard leading up to the last election, having rational conversations with people. I worked in entertainment. I understood that he was a reality star and could see what was coming our way in some respects. I know there are so many other people who are in have deeper problems with their families, having conversations. What would you say to, people who do have, divided families and a tough time having that political conversation? And it's also like making them understand, for me too, being, not only I'm gay and I'm Jewish. I had a couple things.
Lots of bullhorns coming at you.
I did, and a lot of reasons why I didn't want him, as my president. And it's not, it's not even about, for me, Democrat or Republican. It's about being a human being. It's about having empathy. It's about, treating people with respect. It's just, for me, I'm not, there's a lot of people who are deep into, Republican side and the Democratic side, but, look at where we are. I mean, look how divided we are.
Yeah. Well, again, that dark arts rhetoric only works if it divides people. It has to have villain and hero.
Mm-hmm.
And just straight rhetoric, just as a straight up rhetorician. Rhetoricians don't really make moral judgments in the way that other people do about rhetoric. They just look at it as this language playground, this language battleground. And if I see the unethical side, these techniques working, and I'm like, well, I don't want to live in that kind of world. Like I'm a comedian and, I like a very relaxed world. I'm for all the anti-ness there is between human beings, there's just as much pro human beingness. Those two forces are always fighting in the world. This, you walk out the door in New York and somebody's doing something you don't like and you're like, it's easy to feel anti-feelings towards other human beings. But then you walk a couple more feet and you see some little girl, tickling a flower, and you're like, oh, that's nice. So those are always going on. It's just these rhetorics come in and amplify those for political purposes, or for whatever their purposes are in that moment. So anti-ness isn't particularly immoral. It's natural to humans. It becomes immoral when it becomes programmatic and you start, violence and oppression and, taking away opportunity from people and all this stuff that's happened to these groups that have typically been marginalized, in these cultures. What I tell people for when this comes down, bring it all the way out of this big mega theory level, bring it all the way down to, hey, my mom is nuts, which is what most people experience it at. And I get this question a lot. What do I do about my dad who won't get off Fox? And when he does, it's just to yell at me. I'm like, well, you have to look at it not as a rational situation. The problem is people who are rational just they think like there's a flawed persuasion theory of if somebody else is irrational, I will up my rationality, and they will see the quality and then they'll become more rational. It's not the way it works. You have to say, okay, this is not a rational situation anymore. So quit trying to use logic, quit trying to have discussions, quit trying to be civil. All those things that make rationality work are not going to work in that situation. One of the ways to look at it that's very useful is to just think of yourself as a therapist at that moment, dealing with a sick person. And therapists are trained in a lot of persuasion techniques. Like they try their best to not trigger unless they want to do something specifically with a client. So they listen without judgment. And most people are not trained to do that. It's really hard. That's why, you go through years and years of therapy training before you get licensed, because not reacting with like, oh my God, did you just say that?
Right.
It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, we all react. We all have reactions to things coming out of people's mouths.
Yeah, but that's going to kill you in your ultimate goal, which is to get this person back to rationality.
Right.
So learning some persuasion, I tell people just, get some persuasion or therapy training. Like when I have conservatives on my podcast and I do conversion on them. And the first thing I do is I don't challenge them. I don't tell them they're wrong. I don't, say that's crazy, because that just triggers them emotionally and then they can't have a conversation. But it's hard. It's hard to listen to some of that stuff and go, you really? I use humor. Like instead of just being neutral like a therapist, I drag them over into comedy and humor and try to keep that as the tone.
Which is probably a great, the word's escaping me, but like, takes them out of the anger, if per se, or, you're definitely, I can't think of the word I want, but, yeah, I mean, comedy helps, take you. Comedy is great for everything. I mean, it's just, it's a stress relief.
It's safer space for people.
It's a stress relief.
So when I challenge them, like I have a friend who I've had on my podcast a couple of times, and she's actually run for office as a conservative in Vermont. And last time I had her on was before the election. I offered her a corn dog if she would vote for Joe Biden. Like just in the middle of our conversation, I'm like, do me a favor, like vote for Joe Biden. And she's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm like, I will give you a corn dog. I will buy you a corn dog. And she's like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm like, yeah, but you know what's going to happen is you're going to go in the voting booth and you're going to think about a corn dog. And you probably won't vote for Joe Biden, but you'll at least have a corn dog image in your head while you're voting for Trump.
Comedy helps. Comedy helps a lot. Thinking about, Trump and the whole election conversation. What do you believe he understands? I had read that he was a big fan of Adolf Hitler. I don't know if that's true, and I'm not spreading.
Big fan of Hitler. That's a horrible phrase.
It's a horrible phrase, but like he had, there was a story that I had read that he had a book about Hitler, next to his bed. Don't know if it's true, and I'm not, but I'm curious what he has to understand the power of what we're talking about tonight.
How do you explain a book by Hitler next to your bed? Like if you have somebody back to your bed, and they're like, "What's that?" And it's like,
I think it was his ex-wife who said it in the story, but again, I don't know.
That's my light night reading. Trump is not hard to villainize for the left. He does lots of things that the left doesn't like.
Right.
The whole using fiction as truth is a rationality sin, right? It's not an irrationality sin at all. Like for people who are not running a rational game, like if you mentioned the book at the top of the podcast, that the idea of the book is that there are 21 arenas, major coliseums of persuasion. And if you're losing in one, just move to another one. Or if somebody's winning in another one, realize what they're doing and then go over there and fight them there or drag them out of that one. So Trump is a story person. Like he sounds like he's doing logic, but he's actually doing skewed logic. Logic does not hold together very well. It's very easy to make pseudo logic sound like logic. And when you do that, and if you watch the sort of what I call blitzkrieg technique, and they all do it, like everybody in the GOP who gets into the media will do this, where they just barrage with pseudo logic. They don't stop, they don't slow down, they don't allow for questions. It's all claims, fake proof, but it just rolls. And that technique of screed, of just fire hose and pseudo logic for people that aren't strong with logic in the first place makes it sound like logic. And so they will sign off on the things that are being said, especially if it's done repetitively over and over again, which it almost always is by the right because they have a machine.
The repetitiveness is, the repetitiveness is what led to great lighting. The repetitiveness is what led to, what happened a year ago tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's,
the lie was something they continue to,
The lie is the lie is the lie. Like it's just fiction work. It doesn't matter what their lie is. What's amazing people on the left right now is how big the fiction is. And you're like, you can do that much fiction and people accept it? Well, yeah, it's story rhetoric matched up with pseudo logic. And once you get into those phases, if you get into those arenas and you get people locked in there, you can say anything you want. Like Jews, Jews run all the money in the world.
Right. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jews in the laser show or whatever right. Space lasers.
Just pick a villain, make a huge villain claim and just say it over and over again.
And I don't want to, target left or right, but
yeah, you do.
I do.
You do.
I do.
They have falsely balanced things to where you're afraid, you're equivocating about pointing out villains, and you should never do that. I'm giving you a rhetoric technique.
No, that's good because
they're forcing you to equivocate to sound balanced. There's no reason to be balanced about villains.
So do they clear? I mean, they must, and this is just maybe me being naive. They understand the power of persuasion.
Well, I don't know if they understand it, but they know these techniques work, so they use them over and over again. Basically, all they're doing now in the GOP is finding actors who can use these techniques, and then they're giving them the scripts. This is why they have a machinery. The machinery of the right is there's a bunch of money in a big balloon up here, and it's flowing down into think tanks where they have a bunch of smart people, good writers, artists, everything else, creating messaging. Then that messaging is flowed down to political entities and media entities, and it's distributed out to people. That's what I mean by machinery. It's very singular. so that you can get the same script said all over the country, all over the world, again and again and again and again. And that's how you get it into people's heads, is by having the same script said over and over again. The left doesn't have that. We are literally fighting a war machine, like without a war machine. So guess which one's probably going to win?
Oh, there's no doubt that they are winning, sadly. But
they're at least competing. Like, they're competing, even though most of this country doesn't like those thoughts, doesn't like those policies or issues, those beliefs.
Yeah. We were just, I just put up the image of your book, The 21 Coliseums of Persuasion, Winning Every Battle by Knowing Every Theory. Was there a reason you released it? Like, were you always planning to write a book, or was it sort of what you were seeing happening around us that prompted you to write this?
Well, I launched Rhetoric Warriors, the podcast, and that kind of brand during the pandemic, because I had time, because my digital marketing agency kind of went into mothballs for a while. And I'm like, okay, I'm like you, I never really did politics. I knew about it, and I knew the rhetoric foundations of it, but it just doesn't interest me. And then Trump showed up, and I'm like, yeah, people need some protection. We need some better tools and weapons. And so I launched the podcast, and I kept having people, which is what you should ask, and what people almost always do is, can you teach me some of this actionable stuff? Because I have things in the world that are worrying me, and I'd like to be able to have an effect on it. And Aristotle's original definition of rhetoric is the ability to look at every situation and pick the most persuasive options of all the persuasion that's available. So in order to do that, you need the menu of all the different options, and nobody knows it. And so I kept explaining to people, like, quit playing in the logic arena, go over to the story arena, or the emotions arena, or the relationship arena. And finally, it's like, I need a book that can at least lay out the menu. And so then Texas went into a deep freeze. My son moved back in with me for a week because he didn't have power. I had anything else to do, so I wrote a book. So I'm like, okay, this is at least the place. It's like a user's manual for persuasion. And there's a
100%. I read it cover to cover. 100% it is. But for me, it's something like, I don't find it. I understand everything I read, but to put those into play isn't just a one-time read of your book. There's a lot of work that would go into that, and to be able to do it, smart. And I would love to learn more, because it is, I wasn't kidding. I really didn't understand what my parents had gone through as a, younger kid. And, now that they're not around, and now seeing what I witnessed, I never really spoke up about it. And
sure,
having the tools to speak up about it would help me and, people listening tonight to have those conversations. Yeah. So, I mean, the book is really covers 21 theories, but you dive in, and
yeah, I try to give a little bit, a little taste, and again, some actionable things. All this stuff goes from this kind of big mega theory down to very specific, well, what word should I use? And when you go down that chain, every time you wander into one of these Coliseums, literally it's a PhD or 5 PhDs worth of stuff you could study in there. Like learning how to tell stories so that they're persuasively effective. Even comedy. One of the things I'm doing out here in California now is it allows me to get access to a lot more production resources, actors, writers, friends who, shoot and edit and all that. And I'm setting up a what I would call a political comedy production company, because most political comedy that the left creates is for the left. Like if you watch Colbert, you laugh because you're laughing at the horrible people that he's talking about and Trump and everybody else. That's not politically effective. The right isn't laughing at that. So what we really need is commercials and comedy and things like that the right will watch and which will start to change their opinion of somebody like Trump. So think of Larry the Cable Guy or any of the blue collar guys or whatever. If they got on and did some type of, comedy, it was anti-Trump in some ways, at least got a little bit of wedge in there, then it's politically effective. A lot of the messaging that the left puts out is, I don't get it. Like it's totally pointed towards people on the left. I'm like, what's that going to do? You need to persuade the people on the right. So why isn't all of our messaging going into that herd of people? It doesn't make sense to go ahead and persuade people who already basically believe in you.
Unethical rhetoric. Is that an actual, definition? Is there really ethical rhetoric and unethical? Is that like something you learn in school?
What I learned in school is you can make up your own definitions. That's the cool thing about rhetoric. Rhetoric says, look, you've got all these language tools. The only thing that really makes a difference is, can you set them up well enough that other people agree that you've set them up well? So when I split between ethical and unethical rhetoric, ethics is a problematic term if you really go into it, because how do you put one in this camp versus that camp? What's the gray area in between? But I don't care about any of that. People know instantly when I say, oh, what I teach is the power of ethical only rhetoric, like versus people who teach and use unethical rhetoric. Like deception, going fully over into fiction, most of us would say is an unethical talk technique when you are presenting it as real. If you say, look, I'm going to make up a bunch of shit about the election and say it was stolen and, I actually won, then that's fine. You're like, I'm doing fiction. But they're like, no, this is real. So that's unethical.
It's a complicated, it's complicated, basically.
Yeah, humans are complicated. When they talk, it gets really complicated.
That's true. And when they lie, even more so.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. And again, rhetoric can get confusing, and this is one of the reasons why people sometimes pull back from studying it, but it can also get very simple. And a lot of my work in rhetoric has been to extract some of this deep theory and research and bring it back over to where it's simple and basic terms so that people can use it, kind of like we were talking about earlier. And so fiction versus nonfiction is probably a more useful binary split than lying versus not lying. Like people understand fiction.
Mm-hmm.
They understand nonfiction as concepts. And when I tell people, well, Trump's just creating fiction, you don't get upset at science fiction people when they talk about a planet that's, blue and flies. Like we just watched, what was it? The comet destroying the world. Don't Look Up.
Mm-hmm. Just
came out.
Yeah, I just watched.
Like people aren't going, wow, oh my God, they're lying. That didn't really happen. It's fiction. But it's when we allow rhetoricians to go, no, I'm not doing fiction. This is real, that we get into problems. And so if I was interviewing Trump, or if I was a journalist and I had, access to Trump, I'd be like, well, tell me some more of this fiction. Like, you're a great fiction writer. Tell me more about how somebody stole this election from you, fiction man. And I would lock him into that term. I would not let him get away. And that's one of the things rhetoricians do as a technique, is if I can apply my terms to your world, then I control your world. What he's been doing is fire hosing all of his terms onto our world, and nobody's turned off the spigot. Nobody's doing it back to
He's
him.
been controlling our world.
Well, it's because there's no gatekeeper in social media, and cable media and corporate media will report anything now. They need a lot of content. Back before, when there were only 3 networks, he couldn't have gotten on TV ever. He would have been reported maybe in the newspaper where they'd maybe put a couple of his quotes, and so what? That's not going to fire you up. But now, he's everywhere.
Yeah. And social media, it wasn't just social media, it was the media in general that I really, they gave him the platform to speak at the beginning, which
he's running for president. Everybody who runs for president and gets any traction gets some, play in the 24-hour, news cycle.
Yeah.
That's not unusual. It's just he was like, okay, you gave me a little bit, I'm going to grab as much as I can. And as a rhetorical technique, it's unethical, it's dangerous, and it's damaging to your culture and your society, but it's effective. So it's your job to stop it, because when it's effective, they're not going to stop. You have to make them stop. This is the war rhetoric part of rhetoric. People, when they're will to power, when it's a minority coalition trying to get power, trying to take things, they're not going to stop. You have to force them to stop. And so you better get much better with your rhetoric.
Well, he was going to use tomorrow, and use the media tomorrow, but I think it was the media not planning to cover his press conference that got him to cancel that press conference that he was planning.
Yeah, he's kind of in free fall. He doesn't know what to do now. Like, he can't get access. He doesn't have as much control. It used to be, he would control the conversation, and now his power is way below what it used to be. And, he has a lot more challenges now.
Which is better for our country. But enough about him for the moment. I told you this backstage. I was having a conversation with a friend last week who traveled over the holidays to somewhere in the South. He's from Canada, where in Canada he was wearing a mask all the time. And when he arrived in South Carolina, the people he was visiting weren't wearing masks, and he was vaccinated. And he just started falling into their routine. And, being in a new environment, he followed suit, and he fell right in line and didn't mask up. And it hit me because I was in the midst of reading your book and preparing for tonight's show, that it's sort of like a form of rhetoric. And then I got to the chapter where you talk about modeling behavior. And is that the right comparison? Is it a form of modeling behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the Greeks called it praxis, which is just action, where you don't even talk about it. You just control the visible activities of people, and the natural thing for human beings is to fall in sync with those natural activities. It's modeling. You hear on the good side of things, it's like athletes being good role models, right?
Right.
And so, like, you should be a good role model, and then kids watch that, and then they act like you do, which I guess that's a one-to-one comparison. But then when it's negative, it's like, don't act like that guy. It's negative role modeling. But behavior is one of the places we look for instruction. Like when you walk into a culture, or you're talking to, people that, you don't have a lot of information about, the easiest thing to do is to sync up the model. You start a new job, you start to look around for, okay, how's everybody acting? How should I dress? All these kind of things. So yeah, it's a major part of persuasion.
Another thing just popped into my head. It's funny because I met a girlfriend of mine. We've been friends for 40 something years. We met when we were teenagers. And I remember she, it was before I was out, and she would, say things about gay people and other folks. And one day we were in a taxi many years later, and she was talking positively, let's say. I don't remember the conversation, but I basically looked and said, what changed? And it was sort of like it was what she learned at home. She said it, and that's a clear sign. But you gave great examples in the book, things that you learned from other people that you've taken throughout your life. That's a great form of modeling, things that we learn, the positive things we learn from people.
Well, and again, think back to our other example of you got a crazy mom or aunt or dad or whatever friend, and you're like, how do I change this person? And people very quickly run out of options. They're like, well, they're unchangeable. They're irrational. I can't get in there. Well, go to something like, the arena of praxis of behavior. Take them somewhere. Don't talk about it. Don't convince them. Don't use rationality. Take them somewhere where liberals are, or one of the subgroups of liberals, and suddenly they find out, oh, I guess these liberals seem like regular people, and they're nice. I'm like, yeah, you never have to say it, but because the behavior itself, the interaction itself causes change. And it's really hard. That's one of the reasons why so much of this stuff is based in rural communities, because they don't have constant interaction with other subcultures. And so it's really easy to create hate in the abstract. It's really hard to do it when you know people, like once you know a bunch of, people from the LBQT, LBGT.
LGBTQ. It's a lot of letters.
Like I had a mom on who has like I think 2 trans kids. And we talked about it a lot. And she's like, they live in Taylor, Texas, which is a little town outside of Austin. But she started the first gay pride day there. And it was amazing how many people in the community kind of rose up that you never knew were there and supported it. It was very Texan, like they had rainbow ducks, like their high school is the Ducks or something. And so it stayed Austin-y and Texan, and it stayed Texan-y, but it blended that with, sort of gay community and created this nice little thing. And all the media came in and covered it. And suddenly Taylor looks like a brand new place to a lot of people, which may mean that more gay people move there. And so it actually has, a persuasion effect like that.
Right. Positive effect. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of it's because you're watching now, like you're actually getting out and saying, oh, these are just people. And they're interesting people. Usually, the aesthetics are different and, all that stuff. So people find like, that's maybe okay. So I think that's one of our challenges is to get praxis into our right-wing communities where they get experience with people, as opposed to saying, gay people are nice. Well, that's again going through, language versus, hey, let's hang out with my buddy Alan, see what you think of him. I mean, how does somebody not like Alan?
It's fascinating. You talk in the book about how relationships are the most powerful area, or one of the most powerful areas of persuasion. Why so? Why relationships?
Well, once you have a relationship, a direct relationship with somebody, there's consequences to your beliefs. Like I've seen this a lot. When I started grad school at Texas, I was 22 years old, and I'd been in Kentucky my whole life, and Ohio for college. It's also kind of a, rural redneck area. So like I'd learned a lot of gender, a different type of gender politics. Like there's a lot of gender comedy back and forth between men and women in rural communities that doesn't play very well in more sophisticated communities, like teasing gender stereotypes. And I had a friend, we're still friends. In fact, I interviewed her on the podcast once from grad school, who came up to me one day and she's like, hey, the feminists in the department don't find you funny. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm funny. It's like, yeah, you're funny, but you're tweaking and teasing on things that are a lot more sensitive than you understand. You're not sophisticated enough to do this in a way that doesn't offend them. And I had to think about it and go, yeah, you're probably right. No, I'd never run into that type of hyper feminism and intellectualized feminism. So for me, like I love learning, so I'm like, cool, I will change and understand that. And I still use humor, but I'm much better at it so that I'm not offending. I'm having fun, and they're having fun too. But without that kind of direct interaction, I would never have learned that stuff.
I mean, it is incredible, with words, what we can learn from one another.
Well, and it creates that relationship. You asked me about relationship, why it's the strongest thing. I was in danger of ruining my grad student, reputation and experience and credibility within academics, because I was out of my league with people that are far more established and far more educated than I was. And if I'd have just said, okay, I'm going to allow this to be an antagonistic, enemy-oriented relationship, it would have done damage to me. But I realized that, and I'm like, now I'm wrong here. I need to improve this relationship. And so I made changes because I wanted that relationship to be strong. And I became really good friends with, a lot of feminists in the department. Some of them still didn't like me, but that's just the way it goes.
Well, but that's, not everybody's going to like us all, but that's also, you heard them, not, so many times people say things, or, we say things to each other, and not, what they're trying to get across, we don't really hear.
Yeah, well, I'm an improver. I was first generation college. I grew up in Kentucky. I know what education does, and I like improvement. And so I have a deep value for that. And I always try to offer that. It's one of the reasons why I teach and I do these things, because I'm trying to offer people the opportunity to improve our culture, society, people's experience, all that stuff. So I'm always open to improving. People have feedback for me and I'm like, yeah, that's a really good point. I'll learn.
Dr. Dan, we would all be a better society if we all followed that mantra.
Right? Improvement. Great word. There's a piece of rhetoric for you. Let's all pluck that word out, improvement, and just hold on to it as a God term. Like, I want to improve here.
I mean, learn, we can, that's what's so fascinating. I started this show on a whim, the whole Locher Room on a whim. And, a lot of the stuff I do are, actors, or behind the scenes people, but you can learn from anybody. Every conversation we can learn from. And if you all go into a conversation with that in mind, I think the world would be such a better place.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is why, like, if you hang really strong terms up and kind of look at them as beacons, let that drive our behavior instead of hate and fear and these people are bad. Go, like actors. I'm fascinated by actors and talk about people who are always learning and improving. They always want to get better because it gets them somewhere. It makes them, more able in the world. And I think when I start doing retraining on the right, I'm like, well, make America great again. What does that mean? How about let's make America better than it's ever been? And what does that look like? Like, what do you consider to be a great America? To me, it's where everybody's happy. Everybody has an opportunity to pursue, equality and making money and being, safe. Not just like, that's a horrible country. You want half the country to be unhappy? I want everybody to be unhappy. So if I can figure out ways to invite you into that, I'm going to do it because it's important to me.
Yeah, I think it's great. Just a couple more things. So identity politics, we talked about, right and left. How much of our politics has become a war over our very own differences?
Well, it's always been that way. Like public rhetoric, that's what it does. It creates identity slots that you can take. So, red or blue, those are identity pieces, and they're very short and easy to use. They now try to pull up purple, right? And that's a little more confusing. And people try to slip away from identities when it causes them problems in politics, like people saying they're libertarian. It's like, yeah, no, you're not. Yeah, that's just a hiding term. That's a term to hide behind that, you're probably a radical if you're a libertarian, or you're probably a radical conservative. And they may fight me on that identity, but I'm like, okay, well, let's and let's do identity fight and see if I can prove to you that you're a radical conservative. Will they accept it? Again, then we're back into logic wars. But everybody needs identity. Nobody likes to just free float around with zero identity. Even the people who are like, I don't like politics. That's an identity, you know.
But like if somebody's an atheist.
Yeah, but we won't let people. Americans for a long time were non-political. We hate politics. You know, most people would rather stay out of it, but that's not really an option right now. We're gonna you better grab an identity because it's important.
Otherwise, we won't have a democracy.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. Like when you look at sort of the dystopian outcomes versus the kind of middle ground, you know, we've never had a pure democracy anyway. But if we can do a democracy 2.0, that would probably be useful. It probably needs to be revamped. There's too many vulnerabilities in the system right now.
Well, it definitely was proven last year. How long have you been teaching rhetoric now?
Well, I started when I was 23, so 30 years. Yeah, I was teaching as a master's student at UT Austin. I had classes, and like most people don't realize that a rhetoric sequence starts with public speaking. As soon as you take a public speaking class, that's the introductory course in rhetoric. Most people just don't know there are another 100 courses you could take afterwards.
So that's a long time. You know, can you put into words, like, what have you learned teaching it?
We're woefully undertrained, which makes us vulnerable to takeovers by authoritarians masquerading as Democrats. Like everybody talks about like civic training or government training or critical thinking training. We need rhetoric training. Like, I think if people had that, and that's part of my thing about, I'm also trying to start an ethical rhetoric institute where I can offer free training to people and to organizations so that we can up our game. So when I see guys like you who you have a specific issue about anti-Semitism, and I'm like, okay, if you were to bring a rhetorician in or a team of rhetoricians in, they would up your game. They would teach you personal techniques, and they would help you with their messaging and all that, so you could get further, down the line of what you're trying to accomplish. So there's the formal learning component of it, while most people struggle through the informal tools that they've kind of developed and seen and absorbed along the way. I'd say more formal training would be useful for people trying to do good things in the world.
And what does a class that you teach encompass? Like
for example, one of the things I do is persuasion for parents. Like I have a little sub course for that. You can find all this stuff on Substack. Like I write free articles and essays about this stuff, columns. But like that one, most people don't understand that they're training their kids to be difficult later on. Like anytime you use domination with a human being, that's not going to work out well. We don't like it. We learn to fight back, and we learn to become submissive, and we learn to become passive aggressive. So using power on kids is bad training. You should persuade them instead of dominate them. So I teach a class on how to do that.
Truly fascinating. My last question, I mean, and I don't know that you can put it really into words easily, but what do you think our responsibility as a whole to keep, our democratic society process working as it has? What do you think we should all be doing?
Same answer as before. I think you should learn rhetoric. Like if you're a good person and you want good things in the world, you can't just wish for them. You're in a war with people who have very strong unethical rhetoric techniques. They are not going to stop. You have to stop them. And the only way to do that is with really good rhetoric weaponry, And so, I have 115 episodes on my podcast of free education about this stuff. And the book is like, I think $10 or whatever. And there's a bunch of free stuff on Substack. And, bring me into your organization or whatever you're doing, and I will try to train you better to make the right or the left more powerful, because it needs it. Like, this is it's not a game. It's not going away. It's not going to be easy to win. It's like any war. You have to really get your act together if you want to win it.
You have to put in an effort.
Well, an effort and a trained effort.
Right. You can't just go at it. Right. Without any. No, I mean that. I so appreciate you taking the time. I don't have the training.
You're a PR guy. You have a lot of training in that stuff.
To some degree, but the world as it's appearing today scares me in many ways, and because of the strong power that the unethical side is using.
But it's totally winnable. Like, this is what happens every time. The unethical side always looks powerful because the ethical people don't have their act together and they don't take it seriously. Once they take it seriously, they just roll over the unethicals because they're always in the minority of people. Same thing happened to the Germans. Once the whole world was like, you know what? I think I'm tired of this.
But sadly 6 million people had to lose their lives.
Oh, dude, I mean, I'm not saying these rhetorical, like when these big worlds come together and collide, it's not pretty. It's why the war, metaphor works here. It's like, you may not be, Trump doesn't shoot people like earlier authoritarians. He's authoritarian 2.0 because bodies are basically what sank authoritarianism the first time around. Jewish bodies, in camps and all that graphic imagery is one of the reasons why authoritarians have not been in power in most of the world for a long time, because that's such strong rhetoric. It's like, we don't want that. And you sound like that guy. But what's happened now with authoritarian 2.0 is they're not putting bodies on the ground, like shooting rubber bullets at the BLM protesters.
Right.
Firing people, all that kind of stuff, instead of, kidnapping them, because it doesn't look as evil. So again, people don't wake up. They're like, they don't seem that bad.
Well, and then we have people trying to persuade you that they didn't, World War II didn't happen.
Sure.
Or let's, there are many people who telling us that, the insurrection didn't happen the way we all witnessed it happening.
It's just fiction technique. Like, once you label it as that, you're like, I don't care about the morality of it. It's just a fiction technique, and it's pretty clumsy.
What are we calling Trump? What is it?
Mr. Fiction.
Mr. Fiction. I'm gonna buy a T-shirt. I'm gonna start a business.
Yeah.
with his head and Mr. Fiction. Brilliant.
I think, taking his identity from him would be very useful. Like, we didn't do nearly enough of that. Like, don't let him define himself. Don't let him name himself. Change the name. Make him the villain that he is.
It's just in his eyes, he's the best president we've ever had.
I don't know. He's a guy who just says shit. Like, I don't know what he believes or what he doesn't believe. I just know that he's an actor who will just say the script. It doesn't matter to me either. All I care about is what he says. I don't care about who he is.
Yeah, I mean, what he says, has ramifications.
Yeah, I'd like to stop it.
I'd like to
stop him from having access.
Go get him, Dan. I'm on your team.
All right.
Thank you so much for doing this tonight and really sharing your wisdom.
Yeah, super fun. I always enjoy talking to you, and when I had you on the podcast, it's one of my favorite episodes. I love exploring, Hollywood, or like Hollywood experience, and all the different things that people have done, and you've had a fascinating history.
Well, I appreciate that. You stay well, my friend. Happy New Year to you, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, have a great night.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining me tonight. Thank you to Dr. Dan French for joining us. Check out his book. rhetoricwarriors.com. As I leave you tonight, remember, we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard thing, and let us all fight hate and unethical persuasion any chance we can. I truly believe conversations like this can change our world around us. As I said, check out his book, 21 Coliseums of Persuasion, Winning Every Battle by Knowing Every Theory, and go to rhetoricwarriors.com. Please share Conversations with Alan with friends and family, and please join me for the next Conversations with Alan on Wednesday, January 26th, when Judy Shepard, Matthew Shepard's mom, joins me live. Happy New Year, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow